Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen, and I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, we've got to really look at something as we have about approximately 3 weeks left until the U.S. election. All of the rhetoric and propaganda and promises and hyperbole that are coming from both of the candidates, Donald Trump of the Republican Party, Kamala Harris of the Democratic Party, in regards to what their quote-unquote financial or economic plan is for the country if they get elected. And the reality is not much is going to change. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of the great discussion. And, it's just all of this stuff people have to get in their head. These are just campaign rhetoric. Some of the things may eventually get put in, but in the long run, it's really not going to change much.
No, well, firstly, Ken, thanks for joining me as well. Yeah, you came up with this as a discussion point, and I think it's an excellent idea that we cover this because you're absolutely right. As much as party politics doesn't really exist in the US anyway, I know people think Trump being re-elected will change things, but we're not here to discuss that specifically today. But setting that aside, I think for me, the first starting point is in this discussion is it doesn't matter who's elected. Neither Trump nor Harris, Democrats, Republicans, whatever you want to call them, is going to change the enormous fiscal deficit. They're just going to continue to grow and grow the deficit because neither entity, in inverted commas, wants to take the risk of saying, okay, well, we've got to rein in government spending because if they do, the United States will fall off the proverbial cliff edge economically. I mean, that's irrefutable. So I think that's the starting point. So if Trump gets elected, he's not going to change that policy. He can't afford to do that. And he's already talked about making tax cuts. Okay, you're right, Ken. It could well just be pre-election rhetoric. But if he does, who's paying for it? And if you do slash taxes, you're just going to massively continue to increase the fiscal deficit. So therefore, that's an initial problem. And from there, a whole bunch of other issues starts to obviously spiral out of control. And ultimately, as much as anything is what that policy decisions won't change, the outcome is not going to change. And the US is not going to miraculously avoid the collision course with huge economic, financial, and probably ultimately societal problems that will result from there either, because I think some people seem to think if Trump gets elected that somehow can be avoided. And there's all this nonsense in the mainstream media between, oh, is it going to be a soft landing or a hard landing, or maybe it's no landing? These kind of ridiculous statements that are meaningless. And I think for me, that's the sort of starting point of this whole discussion.
Yeah, when it comes to the business media, it's been co-opted as part of the machine, whether it's Wall Street, whether it's the government, it doesn't matter. So they're trying to push whatever landing the Fed. They're in full support of the Fed. They've always been in full support of the Fed since the institution was created over 100 years ago. But the bottom line is that we've had multiple different changes. Back when the Fed was created, of course, we were on a gold standard. Then in following World War I, we started having the transference from the global reserve currency of the pound to the dollar. It wasn't fully implemented until Bretton Woods, 1946 or so, 44. And then we had the era of credit-based currency and credit-based system rather than a monetary-based system. Well, the problem is that the Fed recently decided it's time to cut rates and lower rates. What happens? Both CPI and PPI, the latest ones, burning higher. The yield curve has gone closer and closer to returning to inverted rather than steepening. The 10-year is over 4%. What that really means is the Fed has lost complete control. And really, there's nothing that shows now or in the future. It doesn't matter if Trump wants to come in and cut the government with whatever rhetorical promises. It doesn't matter if he wants to cut taxes domestically. It doesn't matter if he wants to tariff the world into. Everything now is based on the viability of the dollar. And the same thing going with Kamala Harris. She wants to bring in, a continuation of the DEI and pseudo-Marxist type system where they can just print to oblivion and nothing's going to happen. Both of these mindsets, both candidates are going to increase the debt. They're going to increase the deficit. They're going to, Congress at this point, depending on, we don't foresee any type of change. They're going to spend to infinity. The whole purpose is that something that you've mentioned for many years, and I'm in total agreement on, nothing really changes until the viability of the dollar as the global reserve currency either ends or solidifies. And because of the multipolar world, the unipolar system of dollar hegemony is going by the wayside, just as Ernest Hemingway wrote in his book, how do you go bankrupt? Slowly at first, or gradually at first, and then suddenly. And we're seeing the gradually now going on for about probably since 2008. And then it has started accelerating in 2014 with the Maidan coup and the events of the multipolar world. We are getting to the point, if whoever takes over the government, if nothing, absolutely nothing changes and in fact increases, then that suddenly, when it comes to the dollar, could be very much upon us within a couple of years or before even 2030.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the most important points in this as well is looking at sovereign debt, because we know debt's increasing. I don't care about this metric to do with the excuse me, debt to GDP. I don't care, it's irrelevant. Just look at the actual nominal amount, and this is going to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. And the interest on the debt is already over $1 trillion a year. So that means, let's just work on official GDP figures. I'm only doing this to illustrate the point, not because I'm a big fan of GDP. I think it's rather meaningless, but that's about 3-ish% of GDP. Now, if you assume, according to official figures, that GDP growth annually is less than 3%, you can see the problem. And once the nominal cost of servicing existing debt is larger than the nominal growth of your GDP, which is likely to be a significant problem going forward until the wheels totally fall off. And obviously, the cost of your debt is growing faster in percentage term than your GDP growth, then you're in serious, serious trouble. I mean, there's all these projections as to what the deficit will be as a percentage of GDP in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, whatever that might be. And you can guarantee it's always massively under spec. It's always much higher. But as it grows and grows and grows, and the debt to GDP ratio, which is something, of course, they like to use, not from my perspective, it grows to hundreds of percent. I mean, and they just have to keep pumping the printing presses, because they need to just keep increasing fiscal spending, because everything just continues to crater. In the end, you risk then just destroying what's left of any credibility of the US dollar. I mean, we're seeing, for me, very clear evidence recently, the US dollar, US Treasury complex is breaking down. And I've had some odd discussions with some people about this who shall remain nameless. There's nothing sinister about that. Just a private discussion. And we're in agreement that that seems to certainly be the case. And given what we're just seeing lately, as you rightly said, Ken, that when the Fed cut interest rates, everything just went the wrong way. So they have lost control. And I think it's as much as anything because the US Treasury, US dollar complex is breaking down. And therefore, the argument is you're just going to end up printing the currency into oblivion. And how quickly can that happen? Extremely quickly. Particularly if we then come on to, which we will do in a minute or two, broader issues with the economy, no matter who is in office, and how that economy gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And therefore, on that basis, the wheels just will fall off in totality. And because no one, as I said, is going to cut fiscal spending, they're just not going to do that because they know full well what the problem is. So, but it's one of those situations, and I think, I can't remember when it was, quite a few years back, I made a tweet regarding the issue of, what possible options did the United States have? Because there was all this talk about that the US could inflate their way out the debt, which is impossible if you're running enormous fiscal deficits, and those deficits continue to grow. But basically what I said, and it's probably about 3 or so years ago, is the US can't grow its way out of the debt. It's impossible. It can't inflate its way out the debt. And it certainly can't print its way out the debt. So all it can keep doing is keep printing until everything blows up. Or the alternative is it can stop printing and say we're going to have to put the brakes on fiscal spending, and then everything will blow up. So it doesn't really matter anymore what they do. And this is something that will certainly manifest itself probably far sooner in the next presidential cycle. It's not going to be, oh, well, here we are in 2026 or 2027. I think we'll start to see some serious problems happening through 2025. The extent of that severity depends on a whole bunch of factors, but not least government spending, etc., what starts to happen in the real economy. But I think next year we're likely to start to see more and more sort of serious problems, dislocations, structural problems in the economy, and the Fed's going to be sat there going, what do? We can't do anything. And once they've lost control, and lost control in the sense it's a statement of fact they've lost control, then really we're in totally uncharted territory. And that's when confidence can suddenly disappear and in the blink of an eye, and then you've got even more serious problems.
There's something that also stands out of importance. It's not just the fact that the expectation for the U.S. to remain in control of the global financial system is by forcing everyone else to have to buy dollars to hold as reserves, etc. But it's some of the recent commentary that's been coming out from a number of different CEOs and corporate heads and banks, or at least economic analysts from these banks. They are making a mountain out of a molehill when in regards to China. Why? Because there is nothing left to invest in the West. Who in their right mind would invest in Europe, in Canada, even in the United States? Who in their right mind would do that? There's just so many regulation, so much taxation, so much threat of lawfare if you are uncompetitive with the pathetic companies that remain especially in Europe. So they're all looking for China. They're desperate, whatever capital that they have. And I have a hard time saying, distinguishing between credit, currency created out of thin air that they hold in accounts, and actual money or capital, which is what the textbook thing behind capitalism is. But they're so desperate to want to invest in China, and yet they're making up all these stories about how China is falling apart and their economy is doing this, while China's exports continue to rise. I think a lot of that, of course, comes from the fact that Western analysts rely upon information coming from SWIFT and coming from the IMF and coming from the World Bank, which does not monitor bilateral direct trade or anything that is not done in the dollar. So likewise, China, we have Singapore coming up, and Singapore for the longest time was, I don't want to say on the fence, but they were pro-Western minded. Now they're coming out publicly and saying, hey, we're more interested in having partnerships with China than we are with the United States, and Singapore being one of the larger financial centers of the world. I think the bottom line, though, is when you take a look at what has sustained Western empires, especially over the past 100 years, Britain, without its colonies, quickly faded away. The United States, without the ability for others to have to be forced to use the dollar, is very quickly fading away. There's that one key component, and once they lose that, then instantaneously, I mean, just rapidly, they start losing their hegemonic power and control over nations because they have nothing left to offer. And yes, they can browbeat third world countries or smaller countries with war and conflict the same way they went after Saddam Hussein because he was going to start trading oil in different currencies than the dollar. Same thing with Gaddafi, who was going to work with Africa and make an African gold-backed currency. But you can't, but alliances that have risen up in the multipolar world are making it more and more and more impossible for the US to pick and choose these one little lone countries to browbeat. And instead they're making alliances, and they have even if they don't have a military protection, there's that reaching promise that, hey, we're part of the SCO, we're part of the ACN, we're part of these groups, and that if you do something to us, they're going to respond in kind because they respect their partners. Where the US, take a look at Japan as well. Japan dared raise rates for the first time in 30 years, and it nearly was catastrophic for just a quarter point move. Same thing with the US. They cut 50 points. It's going to be just as detrimental. And the question is are they going to respond? And even more, we do not have a Congress that has the wherewithal, either the fortitude or the intelligence to be able to deal with what the public's going to have to go through to do the proper fiscal policy to get back on track.
Yeah, absolutely. Another point's worth making with regards to the US military. Smaller nations don't take the US military seriously anymore. We're not going to get into detail, but we've talked about how the Houthis control the Red Sea, and the US was last December claiming that they'd formed an alliance and remove that problem. It's not happened. The Houthis are in control. The US got kicked out of Afghanistan. The US has been shown to be militarily useless in Ukraine. And the list goes on. So no one sees any US threat militarily, and not least because China, Russia, and Iran have hypersonic missiles, and the United States doesn't. So the military threat doesn't exist anymore. And of course, going forward, the big questions are going to be asked. Well, the US can't afford to sustain 800 plus military bases around the world. So they've got big problems. But there's an argument they can't even afford to bring the military home, and what are they going to do with them? So the military is an enormous problem again. That's irrespective of who's elected. The other thing is US energy. Now, everyone says, well, the US is the biggest exporter of oil in the world. Well, that's slightly debatable, but more importantly, it imports massive amounts of oil. And in fact, the deficit between its oil exports and its oil imports is about 50% on a daily basis. And this is why the US needs heavy oil, because it needs it, as we said, for jet fuel, for bunker fuel, and for diesel, as just 3 examples. So it seems to be increasing evidence. We'll have to see this over the coming months, but US energy exports to Europe seem to be starting to tail off. There is definitely evidence the US shale oil and gas sector's peaked. So suddenly the US is going to have probably in the future have increasing energy problems itself. So that's another problem. And then there's all these debt bubbles everywhere, and they're in everything: commercial real estate, retail real estate. There's all the problems, debt bubbles in just corporate debt, personal debt. Then there's sectors like private credit, which is precarious to say the least. You've got problems now in ETFs because they're sort of trying to utilize them with respect to CLOs, and CLOs is a big problem, even though there's denials that CLOs are like CDOs, which was a big contributory factor to the problems in 2008. So, and then it comes back to the whole financialization of the US economy and that ending, and what that's going to do to the banking system, and what it will do indirectly to the real economy, given the whole US economy is geared around numbers, like bloated financial assets, bloated equities. I mean, and if the bond market continues to be a very volatile, in a very volatile way, then that has repercussions for the banking financial sector. And there's just enormous amounts of the financial system that moved out of banks into what I would call institutions who are far less regulated. That's an enormous problem that is growing on a literally daily basis. So these are all things that aren't going to go away, and it doesn't matter who gets elected, you can't resolve these problems. And then, you know, we fundamentally come back to probably one of the most important points, and that's the US reindustrializing. And how it's going to reindustrialize is just nobody's given it any sensible thought. It's just this idea, well, we'll bring all this business into the United States. Well, we're already discovering that regulation's a huge problem. The project comes in, it's financed, it's massively delayed, it then ends up hugely over budget. Often it's scrapped in the process. And it comes back to the point the United States can't be competitive as an industrial base unless it pays Chinese wages. It can't pay Chinese wages because it blows up the entire economy, financial system, everything. But ultimately, it has to do that. It has to find a way to be able to pay people a salary they can afford to live on, but makes the United States more competitive. Otherwise, it can have industry at home, in inverted commas, but it's going to have massive inflation in terms of prices. People have to pay a lot more for everything. And then, of course, the United States also lacks the resources to be able to do this, because it needs resources from the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the Venezuelans, all countries it declares as adversaries or worse. So these are problems that will not go away, no matter who's elected. But it fundamentally comes back to the point nobody is prepared to show fiscal discipline, monetary discipline, to do the right things and say we need to have a long-term perspective, because presidents really are in office for roughly 4 years. And I say roughly because they don't even take office until January of when they've already been elected. So on that basis, if they start to say we need a long-term perspective, by the midterms they'll be routed. Okay, and I know the argument is it makes no difference because it's the uniparty, so to speak, which you've spoken about for longer than I care to remember. But the point is, there are some subtle differences between the Democrats and the Republicans, and ultimately I think they're growing, and there is certainly great fear in having Trump as president. But the point is that it will be political suicide, in inverted commas, for anyone to take a long-term perspective in the US. And the whole political system is designed that no one's allowed to do that. Hence, presidents are meaningless, just figurehead who push bits of paper around, sign things, make the odd statement, and don't really do anything. So these are huge problems the US faces. And, you go into all the specific detail regarding all these problems. We've talked about some of the things previously, but these are the kind of 30,000-foot view of the United States and the challenges it faces, never mind society, the challenge it faces, what happens as the United States begin economy craters, and because the US is a deeply divided nation, which the political system has done a number on the American people and made them not realize that united we stand, divided we fall, and being sucked into this idiotic political illusion doesn't do them any favors. They need to all stand together and understand. For the US to have a long-term future, it's going to have to radically change every facet of its governance structure and, okay, the legal system, everything, and what it does to its economy. It needs to stop throwing its sort of paper tiger weight around the world as a naked emperor and start to become and strive to be a great nation amongst equals. But that's going to take, well, who knows, a decade, 2 decades? It's difficult to say. I mean, it could happen a lot sooner if there was some actual genuine will to understand hegemony was over, and in fact the United States could return to being the nation it was well over 100 years ago if it had followed that path and carried on doing what it was doing, not deciding to try and become this hegemonic power. For me, the irony is now would have been the United States' time to actually become what you might term a more dominant figure in a multipolar world, because it would have grown, it would have had trust, it would have had time to resolve all its internal problems and actually get itself on a solid footing, and it could have now been in the ascendancy as a nation, whereas it decided to sort of grab a moment in the back end of 2 world wars, thought now's our time, and by that point it had already was in terminal decline, and it was inevitably going to fail, and it staggered along for me longer than you would have expected it to. But since World War II, effectively it's nearly 80 years. So in some ways it's exceeded its sell-by date, and it has to reflect the world's moving on, and it has to change accordingly. Otherwise it will face a very problematic, difficult future, which until it does change its attitude, that problem is never going to begin to be resolved.
I agree. And I think to distill this down to a closing thought is, no matter which candidate, it's likely that if Trump gets in, he's going to understand the problem, but the policies he's going to implement will not be beneficial, will not really resolve anything. On the Democrat side, they're going to do the status quo. They think that there's no problem. They have no clue that there's no problem. And they're going to rapidly send the country down into the toilet, first domestically and then internationally. Anyway, Paul, I think that about covers it. Any last thoughts that you had?
No, I think that's a good enough sort of high-level perspective of the challenges that the US faces in the future, no matter who's elected.
Very good. Thank you, Paul, for being a part of this great discussion.
And likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for being a part as well. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, comment. That helps the algorithm. And send this out to anybody you think it would be of importance. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.